What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
She looked straight at me across the restaurant table on her birthday and said, "You do not deserve to celebrate with me," and while I know people say stupid things when they feel big and untouchable, the way she landed on the word deserve told me this was not a slip but a truth she had been building for a long time, a truth I had fed one transfer at a time. So I raised my glass and smiled in that way you do when you are deciding something you cannot take back and you need the delay of a sip to make it real. I could tell you that my daughter, Ava, earned that dinner with a year of hard work and good choices, but that would be a lie, because the truth is I had kept her afloat with the quiet, invisible payments no one applauds. The rent that did not bounce because I moved money before dawn, the tuition that cleared because I cut corners no one saw, the phone bill that never got shut off because I carried it on my account, and the small emergencies that arrived like clockwork with the same breathless text, always urgent, always not her fault. When she said I did not deserve to be there, her friends laughed in that soft, nervous way people laugh when the mean thing passes for confidence, and my ex sent me the look he has perfected over the years. The one that says I am the difficult one because I ask questions about limits and plans and consequences, and I thought about the nights I spent filling out forms she never read. The calls to banks where I sat on hold while she posted pictures and wrote captions about independence, and the dumb pride I felt every time I rescued her even as I told myself I was encouraging her to grow. If you want to understand how a mother gets to a moment like that, it is not one fight or one insult. It is a stack of small trades where you swap respect for access and boundaries for peace. And you do it so gradually that by the time you notice you are the only one carrying the load, you have already taught everyone around you that this is normal, and they believe you like a script, and then they start writing lines for you too. I am not innocent in this, because I kept smoothing the road, and every time I thought about pulling back I remembered the way my own mother cut me off with a single sentence and a slammed door and swore that pain made me strong. And I convinced myself I was breaking that cycle by giving my child what I never got, believing that kindness alone would teach gratitude, when what it really taught was that I would keep paying and she would keep taking, and no one would say the quiet part out loud. So when she sneered and her boyfriend lifted his glass to toast her wit and called me a guest like I was an outsider at my own table, I felt the weird calm I only get when something is finally decided. And instead of defending myself or explaining the years or listing the receipts, I looked at her and said, "Happy birthday, baby," and I let the moment breathe, because I wanted her to remember that I did not argue, I did not beg, I did not threaten. I just marked the time. I know there are people who will say I should have left right then, that I should have made a scene and thrown the truth like a bucket of cold water across the table, but scenes are messy and they teach nothing except how to escalate. And I have learned that the only lessons that stick are the ones a person gives themselves by running into a wall they were sure would move for them. I paid the check because I always pay the check, and I let everyone hug and pose, and I let my ex tell me I had to stop being so sensitive, and I let Ava announce that she would be going somewhere after and we could meet next time. And I nodded like a woman who wanted to avoid drama, though what I wanted was to end the kind of drama that never stops because it pays too well. On the drive home, I counted the little bargains I had made with myself over the years, the ones where I said I would stop the transfers when she finished school, or when she got a job, or when she moved in with her boyfriend, or when she turned a certain age. And each time I moved the line because I loved her, and because I was tired, and because it felt easier to buy quiet than to demand change, and recognizing that made something in me settle that had been shaking for far too long. I will not pretend I did not feel a spike of guilt, because mothers are trained to feel guilt like a second heartbeat, but beneath it there was a steadier rhythm I had not heard since before I started saving everyone from their own choices. And that sound was the simple thought that respect cannot grow in soil soaked with handouts, and if I wanted her to value what she had to stop hiding how it got there. When I got home, I opened the drawer where I keep the things that matter, not jewelry or photos or cards, but the quiet papers and small tools that mean you still hold the reins even when people talk to you like you are the help. And staring at them, I understood that love is not the same as funding, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do for a person who says you do not deserve to be at their table is to let them buy their own chair. So yes, I raised my glass and smiled, and I let everyone think the evening ended with a toast and polite goodbyes. But that was not the ending at all, because before I went to sleep, I made one simple decision I have postponed for years. The kind of decision that changes a morning before the alarm even rings. And if Ava wants to learn what deserve really means, she is about to, because tomorrow will not open the way she expects. People imagine that a parent who funds an adult child is just handing over envelopes or tapping a card that never runs out, yet the truth in my house was quieter and more structured. Because I learned long ago that if I was going to keep someone afloat, I would do it in a way that let me see the tides and close the gates when the water started swallowing the shore. So I built a system that looked generous from the outside and protective from the inside. A network of linked accounts and shared wallets and authorized cards that all lived under my name, with limits I set and schedules I controlled. And while Ava bragged about independence and rolled her eyes when I asked about budgets, she never bothered to ask whose name was on the account that paid her rent, whose signature sat on the lease security deposit, or whose dashboard held the toggles that could freeze a card, pause an allowance, and sweep idle balances back to the source with a single move. I did not build it to punish her. I built it the year she first missed a payment and spun a story about a friend who forgot to send her share, and when I paid the penalty and she promised it would never happen again. I realized promises are cheap when the cost lands on someone else, so I set up the rent to flow through a sub-account funded from my primary with a monthly refill and a running log that showed me whether she paid on time and whether late fees tried to creep in. And I anchored her phone bill to my family plan with a line that could be suspended from my end without asking permission, and I kept the security deposit in my name because I had signed for the place after the landlord took one look at her income and laughed without laughing, which meant that if I withdrew my consent the lease would stand, but the cushion would come back to me, and that detail mattered more than she ever understood. People call it control. I call it accountability, because the only person who could guarantee that my help did not become her trap was me, and while I kept hoping she would wake up and ask for a clean break with a timeline and a plan, what I got instead was a steady stream of requests that always arrived at the last minute with the same soft entitlement, the kind that wraps itself in innocence and then hardens when you say no. So I learned to say yes while building an exit, a private staircase only I knew about, because love without doors becomes a room you cannot breathe in. After the birthday dinner, when I drove home with that new steadiness in my chest, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the banking app that has seen me through storms bigger than this, and I started with the easiest step, the allowance pocket that refilled on the first of the month, which I paused with a long press and a confirmation, and then I opened the shared wallet that fed her groceries and transit and small comforts, and I changed the setting from active to dormant so that the card in her phone would still exist, but every attempt to use it would return a polite refusal, and I removed her as an authorized user from the credit line she once called her emergency rope, because what it had become was a trampoline for bad decisions that expected me to pay for the bounce. Next came the two pieces that would make the morning feel like a new language, the rent account and the security deposit, because the rent sub-account carried a balance that represented my cushion, not her savings. And the interface allowed a sweep back to the primary with a short note, which I filled with the words I had swallowed for years, a sentence that was not cruel but not soft either, and then I opened the lease folder and drafted an email to the landlord. A simple notification that the guarantor was withdrawing the separate deposit and would cover no future shortfalls, which would not evict her or strand her, but would force her to stand up straight with her own name on the line, since she liked to say she was an adult until the bill came due. I delinked her from the merchant apps that used my cards as a hidden backbone. I canceled the auto top-ups. I changed the password on the shared plan so the streaming and the extras would stop draining my account in slow drips she never saw. And when I reached the part where the app asked if I wished to leave a memo on the transaction, I typed the 3 words that felt like a door swinging open, not for me but for her, and I labeled the sweep with a note that would show up on her screen when she logged in and tried to make sense of the silence, a note that said work for it, which is what I should have said years ago when she first learned that tears move money faster than effort. I know someone will say this is petty or theatrical, yet there was nothing flashy about what I did, No post, no speech, no audience, only a patient undoing of allowances that had turned into expectations. And a careful return of resources to the person who earned them in the first place, because I will not fund a performance where I am the villain and the bank. And I will not let my daughter call contempt independence while my accounts do the heavy lifting in the background. When I finished, I placed my phone face down and sat with the quiet thrum of fear that comes when you finally choose the hard road, and I told myself that if she called, I would not answer in the first minute or the second, because timing teaches as much as words. And I wanted the lesson to land with the weight of reality, so I turned off the kitchen light, went to bed without replaying the dinner, and trusted that the morning would do what mornings always do when you stop rescuing people from gravity and let them feel the ground. The morning did not arrive with drama so much as with a steady drum of notifications that started before sunrise and rolled over my nightstand like a tide that had finally learned it could not push past the wall I built. Because the first call came from Ava at an hour she usually sleeps through, and when I let it ring into silence the phone began choking on messages that moved through the usual stages people use when they think noise can change a decision. Beginning with the sharp accusation that I had embarrassed her on her birthday, bleeding into the half-threat about moving out and never speaking to me again, and then sliding into the same soft panic I know from every month where the numbers do not add up and someone else has to make it right. Except this time there was no someone else, and the accounts she reached for were quiet. The cards that usually passed without a second look were suddenly shy, and the balances she believed were hers had returned home with a single line. That said work for it. I let the calls pile because I wanted the lesson to land without me softening it with explanations or apologies, and as I sat with my coffee I opened my own app and watched the audit log record everything exactly as designed. The allowance paused, the grocery wallet dormant, the authorized user profile removed, the rent subaccount swept and labeled, the security deposit reclaimed from the guarantor line I had carried like a shield for years, and I listened while voicemail collected the narrative I knew by heart, the part where she casts herself as blindsided, the part where I am cruel, and the part where she says this will ruin her life unless I undo it right now, because urgency has always been her favorite tool. And I used to mistake speed for importance, until I realized that when people want to skip consequences, they rename them emergencies, and hope you confuse the two. Somewhere mid-morning the calls turned into calls from other numbers, which told me she had looped in her boyfriend and perhaps a friend or two who have never paid a bill for her but seem to have a lot of opinions about how I should. And I let those go to voicemail as well, because I am not interested in negotiating with people who contribute advice instead of support, and as the chorus grew I thought about the quiet ledger no one sees, the one that shows who showed up and who simply showed off. And I felt something like peace as I remembered every form I filled, every fee I covered, every late notice I intercepted before it reached her pride, and I felt the anger that used to drag me around lose its grip, replaced by a long, slow conviction that this is not punishment, this is a correction that should have arrived years ago. Around lunchtime the bank's alert system pinged to say there had been several declined attempts on the shared wallet and the paused card. And then a new notice landed from the property manager confirming receipt of my email and acknowledging that the separate deposit under my name had been pulled back to me and that any future shortfall would be the tenant's responsibility. Which is a crisp way of saying the training wheels are off, and if she wants to call herself an adult, she can start by meeting the kind of due date that does not move no matter how many texts she sends, and I sat with that for a moment, because I needed to check myself for petty satisfaction, and to be sure that what I felt was not glee but relief. Relief that the structure I built did exactly what it was supposed to do when kindness finally needed a backbone. Her messages shifted again, this time into bargains that tried to sound noble, offers to pay me back later from the raise she swears is coming or to post about me on her pages in a way that corrects the story people tell about me. And I had to laugh at the idea that a public gesture could patch a private hole that has been widening for years. So instead of answering, I drafted the only reply that matters, a single paragraph I saved and did not send yet. A paragraph that lays out the path I am willing to support, not with money but with references and time. A path where she keeps the apartment only if she signs a new agreement with her own deposit and produces proof of income that lasts more than 1 week. A path where the phone line moves off my plan and the streaming logins return to their rightful owner and the grocery card is replaced by a budget she writes and a list she respects, and I promised myself I would send it only after the noise stopped. Because silence teaches and I am done drowning in commentary. By late afternoon the calls slowed to a drip, which told me the panic had hardened into anger or exhaustion, and that was the moment I allowed myself one more step that felt less like revenge and more like closing a door that has been slamming in the wind for too long. Because I opened the insurance portal and removed her as an additional driver on my policy so that she could not call and beg for a rental after another late fee or a ticket she did not see coming, and I canceled the family rideshare profile she leaned on during weeks when the subway felt like an insult, not to strand her, but to make sure that if she needed to move she would have to plan and pay and arrive with a receipt that had her name on it. And then I turned my phone face down again and let the room be quiet, because the next sound I wanted to hear was not another ring or another excuse, but the certainty in my own voice when I finally answered and said the word I have avoided for years. The word that means, the door is still open, but the bank is closed. By mid-afternoon, the story had migrated from my voicemail to the family circuit where opinions travel faster than facts. Because my sister forwarded a string of messages from Ava that painted me as the parent who chose humiliation over love and who stole her child's money out of spite. And while the familiar heat rose in my chest the way it always does when someone rewrites my choices into a villain script, I surprised myself by not racing to type a defense or attach screenshots or tally the years in a single dramatic paragraph, since I have learned the hard way that when you argue with a version of yourself that exists to feed someone else's need, you will always lose to the appetite. So instead I called my sister and told her that I was fine and that I would not be engaging in a comment war, and I asked her, just once, to remember who has paid what for how long and who keeps changing the rules when bills arrive. And after a long breath she said she knew, that everyone knew, they had just been waiting for me to say it without backing down. From there the call shifted in tone, because my ex rang to deliver his favorite monologue about how I was making things worse by being so rigid, and how a little flexibility in a crisis proves you are a decent person. And I let him finish his speech about decency while I opened my laptop and placed a freeze on my credit with each bureau, added a verbal password to my bank profile that only I could answer, and disabled the forgotten backup cards tied to delivery and rideshare apps where her boyfriend's name had been quietly added as a secondary user months ago. And then I told my ex that decency is not the same as funding denial, that a crisis loses its power when the person who created it stops outsourcing the fallout, and that I loved our daughter enough to stop buying her the illusion that life bends for her. And when he sighed and said I was being dramatic, I thanked him for the input and hung up, because there are some conversations that only exist to pull you back into the old choreography, and I am no longer about to dance on cue. When I finally answered Ava, she did not begin with hello or with any acknowledgement of the dinner, or the years behind us. She began with a rapid list of consequences I had apparently caused. From the landlord who now wanted a replacement deposit in her name to the bank that declined her card for groceries to the streaming accounts that asked for a password she did not know. And she said all of it like a prosecutor who had already drafted my sentence, and I told her as calmly as I could manage, through the storm in my throat, that what she was experiencing was not cruelty but gravity, that the supports she had relied on were never obligations, and that they had been withdrawn because she told me, in front of a room full of people, that I did not deserve to be at her table, and I explained that I was still her mother and would show up for references, interviews, and the kind of help that multiplies effort rather than erases it, but that the bank was closed, the rescue line was cut, and the only path forward I would support now was the one that required her to stand up and do the boring work every adult does when no one is watching. She tried anger and found it heavier than she expected. Then she tried pity and seemed surprised that I did not rush to carry it for her. And when she switched to bargaining, I listened without interrupting because I wanted to hear whether she had a plan or just a plea. And when the plan did not appear, I read the paragraph I had written the night before, the one that said she could keep the apartment if she brought a new deposit with her own name on it and provided proof of income that had survived at least a season, the one that said the phone line would move off my plan and the subscriptions would revert to their owner, and that I would meet her at the bank to help set up an account she managed alone. And I told her that none of this was punishment. It was simply the cost of calling yourself independent, and that I would help with the paperwork if she wanted a witness, but not with the payments, because witnesses tell the truth and payers end up erased. She went quiet long enough for me to think the wall had finally appeared in front of her, and that she might be seeing it as real for the first time, but then she exhaled and told me she would go public, that she would write the post and start the thread and tell everyone what I had done, and I said she could tell her story however she wanted, because I have kept receipts in drawers and in memory, and I am not afraid of light anymore. Yet I also told her that a crowd cannot fix a budget and that the landlord's due date cannot be bullied by comments, and she hung up on the sentence where I said I loved her too much to pretend that noise is a plan, and for a long minute I stared at the quiet phone and wondered whether I had misjudged my timing. Until an email landed from the bank saying someone had attempted to add a new device to my profile and had failed the verbal password, and as I clicked to confirm the lock, a new text lit the screen from an unknown number that read in the tone I know far too well that if I did not reverse the transfers by nightfall, she would be at my door with bags and a story about safety that would force my hand, and I set the phone down, breathing steady, because the locks were already changed, the porch camera was on, and the only thing left to decide was whether I would open the door to an old pattern or keep it closed to protect the future I had finally chosen. By the time evening slid in and the city started sounding like it always does at the end of a workday, the calls had thinned into a stubborn pattern of ringing without messages, and while part of me wanted to answer if only to end the suspense, I kept the line quiet and chose a meeting that would not bend to drama, so I texted Ava a single sentence inviting her to meet me at the branch where I have opened and closed more lifelines than I can count, because I wanted a room with a clock on the wall and a banker at the desk and forms that would not let either of us lie about who carried what. She arrived with that brittle confidence people borrow from outrage, and she sat without a hello and started in about cruelty and reputation, and how I had forced her into a corner that would follow her forever. And I listened without interrupting because I needed her to run out of air before the work started, and when she finally stopped I slid a thin folder across the desk, not a stack designed to humiliate, just a clean ledger that showed transfers by month. Deposits with my name, fees I covered, late notices I intercepted, and the screenshot of the note that lived in her app this morning, not to taunt her but to make one point impossible to dodge, which is that I did not take what was hers. I reclaimed what I had loaned to a story that kept promising to grow up and never did. The banker, who has seen parents and children circle each other in this room for years, confirmed what I had already explained, that the sub-accounts were mine and the authorizations were mine and the guarantor status had been withdrawn. And then he turned the page to the only part of this that mattered going forward, a new personal account in her name alone with no links to me, no shared wallets, no hidden lines that could be yanked when feelings got loud, and he slid the signature pad to her. With the same tone he uses with anyone, a steady tone that says choice lives in ink, and as she signed I felt the first honest breath I have taken in years, because I knew that whatever came next would be real. Before she could ask for a reversal or a bridge or a grace period that turns into the same old cycle, I placed one card on the table, a simple debit tied to a small account I had never touched. The wages from the summer she actually worked and came home smelling like effort and talked about the pride of buying her own lunch, and I told her that balance was intact because I respected what she earned even when I did a poor job respecting what I enabled. And I said that if she wanted to feel that pride again I would not stand in the way, but I would also not pretend to be the net that catches a leap she never prepared for. Then I made the offer that was not a bribe and not a trap and not a bargaining chip, an offer that would either push her forward or reveal that she only wanted me back in harness. Because I told her that if she held a job for a season and brought me pay stubs that did not bounce and a signed lease addendum with a deposit in her own name, I would match the amount she saved during that season one time into this new account and then step completely out of her money forever. No more plans, no more Shared logins, no more quiet rescues dressed as love, and I watched her eyes flicker as the shape of it hit, because the proposal demanded proof instead of promises, and it rewarded discipline rather than noise, which is the kind of help that makes people if they decide they want to be made. She called it manipulative, and I said it was conditional. She called it cold, and I said it was honest. She said I was choosing my image over my child, and I said I was choosing to stop pretending that dependence is affection. And when she tried to pivot to the boyfriend's outrage, I put the second folder on the desk, the one with the failed device login, the secondary user deletion, and the timestamped notices from the rideshare and delivery apps. And I said that anyone who wants to stand next to her while she builds is welcome, but anyone who wants to stand on me to stay afloat can find a different dock, because I am closing this harbor. There was a long pause that felt like the first stillness we have shared since she was little and did not know what bills were. And in that quiet, I reminded her that I loved her enough to stand up to her, and that I would be at every interview she asked me to attend, and that I would read every resume she sent, and that I would sit on the phone with the landlord if she needed a script for the call, but that the wire that tied my account to her days had been cut and would not be soldered back together. And I told her that if she wanted to talk about budgets, I had the spreadsheet, and if she wanted to talk about blame, I was leaving the branch. She did not cry, and she did not hug me, and she did not promise a clean break. She gathered the papers and the small card and said, in a voice that shook with equal parts rage and fear, that I would regret this. And I said that I could live with regret a lot easier than I could live with resentment, and I left her with the banker, because banking is business, and business is where feelings lose their camouflage. And when I stepped outside into the evening that felt the same as any other evening, I understood that victory does not always come with music. Sometimes it is just the absence of the old pain. On the way home, I turned my phone back on and watched it light with new messages that tried fresh angles and recycled old ones, and I let them line up without answering, because I have already said what matters. And when I walked through my front door and set my keys down, I knew the final move had landed exactly where it needed to, not on her neck and not on my shoulders, but on the path in front of her where work is waiting and respect is possible. And I did not slam a door or post a speech or craft a caption. I simply wrote one last line to myself on a sticky note I keep by the charger, a line that read, "The bank is closed and the door stays open for whoever knocks with proof." And then I turned off the light and let the quiet be the proof that I finally won.